So this one is actually more alarming. But in the red, you see the exponential growth of the debt. In the green, you see declining revenues. And in the orange, you see the increasing deficit. So, as the interest rates go up, the revenues are going to go down, and the debt is going to go up, and the deficit is going to go up. That is the perfect storm for getting crushed. And Opti, actually, if you could, I'd really appreciate if you could pull up the US debt clock, which is usdebtclock.org.
Yeah, I
Because
got you.
I've been watching the US debt clock for close to 14 years now. And in my recollection, this is the only time where we have seen what you're about to see with your own eyes. Look right there in the top left, you have the debt 33.7, but move over US tax revenue. Yeah, no, zoom back in like that. That was beautiful. Yeah. Okay. So the national debt is going up. The deficit is going up. But look what's happening to the revenue. It's going down. Let me ask Jay Powell a question.
Oh,
If the economy was growing by 4.9%, because that's what they said GDP was, 4.9%, how is the tax revenue going down? How do you have an economy when you maybe even better for people to realize this? I got you running around here, Opti. I apologize, but you're good at it.
no
You're
worries,
quick.
no worries.
I
What
think
do you need?
I think going to Shadow Stats. I think if you go to shadowstats.com and we show the GDP chart, it will kind of give you an idea of how ludicrous the claims that the Bureau of Labor Statistics are putting out. The manipulation of the data is so bad at this point that I am actually working on my own website that puts together all this, because every once in a while I sit down and I plug all these numbers into the equations just to see where we're at, and I'm getting annoyed with it. So I want to automate the process, and I'm going to create that website so that everybody has access to the most important numbers that any macro manager can have access to. And when you get that up on the GDP on Shadow Stats, what we're going to see is that the government is claiming with 4.9% GDP that we're not just growing faster than we were pre-COVID. We're growing faster than we were going all the way back to the early 80s. So they're saying that this is the most growth, and I'm still seeing the debt clock. I'm not sure if everybody is still.
Yeah, here we go. I'm trying to find it on the site.
Okay, so. Yeah, so go to alternate data.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yep. And then gross domestic product. There we go. Boom. So the blue line is actually accounting for real inflation. The red line is what the government claims. Well, take a look at where that red line, they're saying that we're at 4.9%. That's more growth than pre-COVID, of course, but that's more growth going all the way back to the early 80s. They're saying we have after doing the largest, most aggressive interest rate hike in modern financial history, they're saying we have the strongest economy because the data is botched. Inflation is not being accounted for properly. When you look at GDP, they're supposed to, just like when you find real rates, right? Where we talked about real rates, the nominal rate is 5.5%. If we believe the Fed and the inflation rate is 2%, then our real rate of return is the 5% minus the 2%, which is the 3.5%. Well, in GDP, it works the same way. You have what's called the GDP deflator, and that's how you go from nominal to real. So they're saying that GDP is 3.5%. So they're deflating GDP by 3.5%, but inflation is not 3.5%. So that's why the GDP number is the nominal number that they're promoting to promote their narrative is telling us that we have the strongest economy since the early 80s. That's just not true, because when you account for real inflation, look at the blue line. Growth is still negative. We have only shrunk less and less since COVID. We have not experienced any real growth. Now, a lot of people know that the definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. Well, the definition of a depression is 1 quarter of greater than negative 10% GDP, or 12 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. Well, you'll see there in 2020, we went just below the 10%. So in 2020, we actually entered and fit into the definition of a depression. Now, of course, it was an artificial depression based on the lockdowns, but we met that definition. Now, what's concerning is that we met the definition of an artificial depression through the lockdown, which brought us to negative 10%. But since then, we have not been positive. We've been shrinking less and less, absolutely, because we're recovering, but we've never gone positive. And if GDP doesn't turn positive by the end of this quarter, this is the 12th quarter. So we will have met, the United States of America will have met both definitions of a depression, both at least 1 year of greater than negative 10% GDP, plus 12 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. Meanwhile, the government is telling you we have the strongest economy since the early 80s. The mishandling of inflation is what's skewing all of the data. So then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, are they botching this, or are they incentivized to do this? Well, everybody in Bitcoin knows that funny scammer saying where it's like, hey, send me a Bitcoin, I'll send you 2 back, right? Have you ever heard a scammer tell you, hey, send me 1 Bitcoin and I'll send you 0.95 back? Well, hell no, they never said that, because there's no incentive for the person to send the Bitcoin. Why would I send you 1 Bitcoin to get less back? I want more back. Well, the government, in the same way the government is incentivized to tell you a lower inflation number, right? Because when they tell you a lower inflation number, that's the equivalent of creating a fake real yield that's higher than it really is, right? Because you take the 5% that you get on the 3-month, you subtract it from their 2% claim, and you got real growth of 3% year over year. But if you take the 5% and you subtract the 7.5% real inflation, you're at negative. So why would we lend the government money and expect to get a negative return? Why would we send the Bitcoin scammer a Bitcoin because he promised to give us 0.95 Bitcoin back? Right? The Federal Reserve is not, they're smarter than that. So they're incentivized to state a lower inflation number, because the lower inflation number allows you to subtract a smaller number from the nominal yield, which fluffs up the real yield number. And because they have that incentive, people really shouldn't be trusting their data, a lot like why you shouldn't have trusted a lot of the vax data, that it was safe, it was tested. I mean, the right amount of time didn't pass by to do the proper testing. So it's unfair to say that it was safely and properly tested, because the right amount of time didn't even go by to do the right, safe, and proper testing. It's just obvious. But they had incentive to lie about it because they made billions of dollars. Well, the government has an incentive to lie about the inflation, because as long as they can make us think that we have a real yield, a real rate of return that's positive and not negative, then we'll keep lending them money. And that's what the market is figuring out. The market is starting to figure out, this is unbelievable. They've been telling me this, but the reality is this. And when I adjust to the reality, I'm actually sending this guy a Bitcoin and getting 0.95 back. This is not going to work. I don't want to lend my money to them. And people are selling the debt because the debt is being devalued, because the people are waking up to the fact that the data is not accurate. And it's not just, that's why the inflation number is so important. If anybody ever asked, why are they so focused on inflation? Because inflation plugs into everything. It plugs into real GDP. It plugs into real yields. It plugs into real sales. Inflation is the number that you subtract from the nominal sales or GDP or yield to get the real number. So they want to manipulate the real number. And in order to manipulate the real number, it's not just about manipulating the nominal yields. It's about manipulating the deflator that you use, the inflation number that's subtracted from that nominal number that gives the real number. And that's where the marketplace incentives come from. So if real yields are positive and you can grow your purchasing power over time, then the marketplace is incentivizing you to save, right? If you can grow your purchasing power over time, then it makes sense to save, not to spend or invest. Save, because you can buy more tomorrow. But when the real rate of return is negative, the marketplace is incentivizing you to spend or invest because you're going to be able to buy less tomorrow. You'll be able to buy less food, smaller house, less shares of the company because the real rate is negative, and it incentivizes you to spend or invest when the real rate is negative. So that's the breaking apart of the market right now. Some people in the market, you got the Ray Dalios and some of these bigger guys coming out, the Paul Tudor Jones, they're coming out and saying, hey, we're not being compensated enough for this, so we don't want to hold the debt because the real rate of inflation is actually higher than what they're saying. Therefore, my real yield is negative. Therefore, I'm going to spend or I'm going to invest. I'm not going to save because I'm not gaining any purchasing power. I'm sending 1 Bitcoin and getting 0.95 back. I want to send 1 Bitcoin and get 1.1 Bitcoin back. I need to increase my purchasing power, not decrease it. So that's what's really going on here with the manipulation of the inflation data. And that's why the focus is on the inflation data, because it plugs into everything else in order for the marketplace to determine what those incentives are. And half the marketplace, or maybe 3/4 of the marketplace, believes the Fed and thinks the rate is positive. And that's the $21 billion that piled into TLT, plus literally trillions of dollars that was lent directly to the government. And then the other half is saying, well, real yields are negative, so I'm not going to lend my money. I'm going to spend it or invest it because I'll get more today than I will tomorrow. And that's where the marketplace is right now. And we're on the brink. We're on the brink of more people realizing it than not. And that's when everything will shift. That's the catalyst.